Okay, so let's dive right into this. Like, imagine, right, there could be another you out there, not just any other you, but a perfect double of you. And I mean perfect. Every thought, every feeling, even every memory, exactly the same.
Okay.
But here's the catch. In that scenario, you, the actual you, well, you wouldn't exist. Only your double would be there, living what seems like your life.
Yeah.
Crazy, huh? It really makes you think about what identity even means.
Yeah, and that's what's so fascinating about this and why it's such a big deal for philosophers.
Mhm.
This isn't just some sci-fi idea we're tossing around. This is a real hardcore metaphysical problem. We call it Haecceitism.
Haecceitism, okay.
Look.
So what's the philosophical idea behind this?
Well, basically, Haecceitism says that the world could be different, not in terms of what properties exist, but in terms of which specific individuals have them.
Okay.
So think about your double again. The world with your double, but not, you would have all the same properties, all the same stuff. But it would be different because a different individual would be experiencing all of it. And that right there is Haecceitism.
Right, so it's all about who's who, even if everything else looks the same. But we're not just pulling this out of thin air for this deep dive, are we?
No, not at all. We're actually basing this exploration on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Haecceitism. It's a really in-depth and thorough look at the concept, going through all the arguments for and against it. It also looks at how different thinkers have formulated it and all the ways it connects to other areas of philosophy.
Awesome. So our mission today is to really break down this idea of Haecceitism, right? We want to get to the bottom of what it means and what the implications are and why it causes such a big debate among philosophers. It's one of those concepts that really messes with our basic intuitions about what it means to be an individual and what's actually possible.
Yeah, totally. It makes us question, like what individuality really is and how our qualities connect to our unique thisness. So how do we even start to tackle this thing?
Well, the Stanford entry jumps right into the fact that Haecceitism is a modal thesis. And I think most of us who are into philosophy know that modal has to do with possibility and necessity.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And the entry actually points out two main ways philosophers approach this modal stuff. First, there are these philosophers called modalists, and they try to understand possibility and necessity without using the idea of possible worlds.
Okay.
So for them, anti-Haecceitism, the opposite of Haecceitism, is defined as necessarily the world couldn't be non-qualitatively different without also being qualitatively different. So basically for a modalist, accepting Haecceitism just means saying that this statement isn't necessarily true.
Got it. So some philosophers prefer to just stick with the concepts of possibility and necessity themselves. But then obviously there's this other big approach that does use the idea of possible worlds, these other realities that could have happened.
Exactly. And that's where the entry brings in the framework of possibilities. And it makes a really important distinction between maximal and non-maximal possibilities. Maximal possibilities are complete and total ways the universe could have been, like everything down to the last detail.
Okay.
Non-maximal possibilities, on the other hand, are more limited. They just focus on specific things, like the possibility of rain in a particular place.
Okay, so it's the difference between the entire picture of a possible reality and just zooming in on a particular aspect of it. And then it gets even more refined because we have to distinguish between qualitative and non-qualitative possibility.
Right. Qualitative possibilities are all about how the world could be in terms of what properties exist, but without talking about specific individuals, like the possibility of a red sphere existing somewhere.
Okay.
But non-qualitative possibilities, on the other hand, are about specific individuals. For instance, the possibility that this red sphere right here was blue at some point.
So given all these distinctions, how do we actually state what Haecceitism is within this whole framework of possibilities?
Well, the entry presents something called possibility Haecceitism, which basically says there are distinct maximal possibilities that only differ in terms of the non-qualitative possibilities they include.
Okay.
So back to your double. Imagine a maximal possibility where every qualitative detail of your life and the world is the same, but you aren't the one experiencing it. It's your double.
Right. All the same qualitative possibilities, all the same properties are there, but the difference is in who is actually living that life. Now the entry brings in the idea of possible worlds. How do they fit into all this talk about possibilities?
Well, for most philosophers who think possible worlds are real, these maximal possibilities correspond directly to specific possible worlds.
Okay.
So a world where your double exists, but not you would be a different possible world, even though it would be qualitatively identical to the actual world.
So basically, Haecceitism, when you think about possible worlds, suggests that there could be multiple possible worlds that are qualitatively the same but different in terms of who exists. But the entry warns that calling this world indiscernibility can be a little misleading. Why is that?
That's where all the different theories about possible worlds come in. It gets a little complicated and subtle, but it's important to be clear. The problem comes up especially with what we call ersatcist views of possible worlds.
Okay.
Ersatcists don't see possible worlds as like actual concrete alternative universes, but more as abstract things like sets of propositions or collections of properties or even just linguistic descriptions.
So if possible worlds are just abstract descriptions or sets of information, what does it even mean for them to be qualitatively indiscernible, like two physical objects could be?
Exactly. If you think of a world as like a set of propositions, those propositions themselves might not even have qualitative properties in the same way a physical object does.
Okay.
So you could have two different sets of propositions representing two different worlds, one with you and one with your double. But they could still contain all the same qualitative propositions. They would be qualitatively indiscernible in a kind of abstract way. But that wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with whether Haecceitism is true about the concrete world.
It's kind of like saying you could have two different instruction manuals that give you the exact same instructions for building a piece of furniture, but the manuals themselves are still different physical objects. Just because the outcome is the same doesn't mean the descriptions are the same.
Exactly. A perfect analogy. So for many ersatcists, whether or not there are qualitatively indiscernible worlds comes down to what these abstract entities are like, not directly to the big metaphysical question of Haecceitism.
That makes sense. So ersatzists need to find a way to talk about Haecceitism within their own theories. And the entry mentions world Haecceitism. What is that all about?
World Haecceitism is a particular view held by some ersatzists who accept possibility Haecceitism, the idea that there are distinct maximal possibilities that only differ in non-qualitative ways.
Okay.
But they also believe that there's a one-to-one correspondence between these maximal possibilities and their corresponding abstract possible world.
Cool. So for them, if there's a distinct maximal possibility with my double, then there's also a distinct abstract possible world that represents that possibility.
Precisely. And then to make things even more interesting, the entry mentions David Lewis's idea of cheap Haecceitism. So what makes it cheap?
Well, it's called cheap because Lewis tries to get the benefits of Haecceitism, the possibility of these non-qualitative differences, without having to say there are tons of different possible worlds in his modal realism. He uses his counterpart theory to argue that one possible world can represent multiple maximal possibilities that only differ in Haecceitistic ways.
Interesting. So instead of saying there's a whole separate world with your double, Lewis says that our actual world can represent that alternative possibility through these counterpart relations. Okay, that's a good foundation on how we can formulate Haecceitism. Where do we go from here?
The next big thing the entry talks about is Haecceities. These sound like they're at the heart of this whole debate. What are they exactly?
Think of Haecceities as the ultimate individual identifiers. It's like the property of being Napoleon, or going back to our puzzle, being identical to you. These are properties that are completely unique to specific individuals. They're sometimes called thisnesses or individual essences.
So the Haecceitistic difference between a world where I exist and one where my double exists is that in one world, the Haecceity of me is there, and in the other, it's the Haecceity of my double.
Exactly. And these Haecceities are usually thought to be closely tied to the existence of the individual. Like the property of being Napoleon only exists if Napoleon actually exists.
And then the existence of other non-qualitative properties, like, say, being 5 feet away from Napoleon at noon on June 18th, 1815, depends on whether these basic Haecceities exist and how the qualitative properties are distributed.
Exactly. But, and this is important to remember, the entry points out that Haecceitism isn't just about believing in Haecceities. You could believe in these individual essences and still reject the idea that the world could be different in a non-qualitative way without any qualitative changes.
Okay.
Haecceitism is about the modal aspect, about what's possible.
Right. It's not just that these individual specific properties exist, but that they could be arranged differently in different scenarios, even if everything else is the same. Now, we've been using the terms qualitative and non-qualitative a lot. How do philosophers actually tell the difference between these two types of properties?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And the entry does a good job of going over the different ways philosophers have tried to figure it out. Sometimes they just go with intuition and say that non-qualitative properties are the ones that seem to directly refer to a particular individual.
Okay.
But there have been attempts to define qualitative properties in terms of something more basic, like David Lewis's idea of perfectly natural properties. Other approaches focus on how non-qualitative properties depend on the existence of specific individuals. And then some philosophers think this distinction between qualitative and non-qualitative might just be a basic primitive thing that can't be broken down further.
So there's no easy answer everyone agrees on. And what about those properties that don't seem to fit neatly into either category, like being possibly statue or being self-identical or even being a tiger?
Yeah, those are the tricky cases. The entry points out that there's a lot of debate about whether modal properties like being possibly a statue or logical properties like being self-identical or even kind properties like being a tiger are qualitative or non-qualitative.
So it's not always clear-cut. Okay, so Haecceitism are these properties that are unique to individuals. What about their metaphysical status? Are they universals or tropes or something else?
Yeah, the entry gets into that, explaining that discussions about Haecceitism are tied to the bigger debates about properties in general, but Haecceitism do seem to have some special characteristics. They're not usually thought to be multiply instantiable like a qualitative property like redness.
Okay.
There's only one Napoleon, so only Napoleon can have the property of being Napoleon. Also, Haecceitism don't really explain why different individuals resemble each other qualitatively.
Interesting. So just because I and, let's say, Barack Obama both have Haecceitism doesn't mean we're qualitatively similar in any way.
Right. And the entry goes over different philosophical ideas about how to fit Haecceitism into our bigger picture of metaphysics. For example, Lewis trying to understand them in a class nominalist way, as unit sets of individuals, or maybe sets that include counterparts across possible worlds. Other philosophers see Haecceitism as even more fundamental and say they're the basis of how things are individuated.
And that brings us to the connection between Haecceitism and fundamentality, doesn't it? If the most basic properties determine everything else, and if Haecceitism is true, then it seems like some of these non-qualitative properties might have to be fundamental too.
Yeah, that's a really important point. If qualitative properties aren't enough to determine the distribution of Haecceitism across possible worlds, then Haecceitism would mean that reality includes both qualitative and non-qualitative stuff. The qualitative stuff tells us what properties are instantiated, and the non-qualitative stuff tells us which individuals have them.
And last but not least, there's a debate about the modal status of Haecceitism, meaning whether they exist necessarily in all possible worlds or just contingently.
Right. Some argue that a Haecceitism like being Napoleon exists in every possible world, even if Napoleon never existed in some of them. Others say that such a Haecceitism only exists in the worlds where Napoleon exists. It adds another layer to our understanding of these individual essences.
Okay, we've covered how to formulate Haecceitism and the nature of Haecceitism. The entry then moves on to how Haecceitism is related to essentialism. What's the connection there?
Well, essentialism is the idea that individuals have some properties that are essential to them, meaning they couldn't exist without those properties. Accidental properties, on the other hand, are the ones that individuals could lose or gain without changing who they are.
We hear about essentialism all the time in philosophy. The classic example is origin essentialism, the idea that for biological entities, where they came from is essential to them. So the argument goes, George W. Bush couldn't have had different parents and still be the same George W. Bush.
Exactly. And the entry points out that essentialist ideas come in different strengths. Weak versions, like the claim that everything is essentially self-identical, aren't really controversial. But strong versions, like origin essentialism or even hyper-essentialism, the view that almost all of an individual's properties are essential, have bigger implications for metaphysics.
No, it seems like if you really believe in essentialism, it might make Haecceitism less plausible. If all these properties are essential to me, how could I be swapped out for someone else in a world that's qualitatively the same? Wouldn't that mean some of my essential properties would change?
Yeah, that's a natural thought. And while a strong essentialist view like hyper-essentialism would rule out Haecceitistic differences, where you have different properties in another world, it doesn't rule out all forms of Haecceitism. The entry gives the example of mass replacement.
Tell me more about that.
Imagine a possible world that's exactly like ours in every qualitative way. But instead of us, you, me, Barack Obama, the Eiffel Tower, there are different individuals who have all the same properties and play all the same roles.
Yep.
That's a Haecceitistic difference, a difference in who is who, not in the properties themselves. But it doesn't necessarily contradict hyper-essentialism because none of the individuals from our world exist in more than one of these qualitatively identical worlds. Every individual in the other world has all their properties, essentially.
Okay, so even if everyone in each world has all their properties, essentially, the actual individuals in those worlds could still be different. That's interesting.
Yeah. But the entry does say that strong essentialist views do limit certain types of Haecceitistic differences, especially those where individuals swap properties or roles.
Yeah.
For example, origin essentialism wouldn't allow for a scenario where you, with your actual parents, somehow ended up with Barack Obama's parents. That would violate what's essential to both of you.
Right, because your origins are considered essential and can't be swapped.
Yeah.
Now, the entry also mentions extreme Haecceitism. That sounds pretty out there.
It is. Extreme Haecceitism says that the only essential properties individuals have, besides really general ones like being self-identical, are their Haecceities. So according to this view, Napoleon could have been, say, a poached egg, and there could still be a possible world that's qualitatively identical to our history, but with a poached egg playing Napoleon's role.
Wow. That's really pushing the limits of what's possible. It almost sounds like anti-essentialism, which the entry points out.
Exactly. It's often called a type of anti-essentialism because it denies that individuals have a lot of essential properties besides their basic thisness. But this extreme view usually goes along with the necessity of identity and distinctness.
Right.
This means that if two things are different in the actual world, they can't be the same in any other possible world.
So while I could have been a poached egg playing a different role, I couldn't have just been Barack Obama. My thisness stays the same.
Right. And lastly, the entry talks a bit about sufficiency theses, the idea that having certain properties is enough to determine that something is a specific individual. While these are related to essentialism, the entry suggests they don't really offer a way to argue against Haecceitism without assuming that it's false to begin with.
Okay, so Haecceitism and essentialism aren't necessarily at odds, though strong essentialist views will limit the kinds of Haecceitistic differences you could accept. Now let's get into the arguments for Haecceitism. What are the main ones?
Well, the entry focuses mainly on two: arguments based on conceivability and the challenge posed by Chessum's paradox. The conceivability arguments are probably the easiest to grasp.
Right, these are the ones that say, if we can imagine something, it must be possible, and then they draw philosophical conclusions from that. What kind of scenarios do they use?
One of the classic examples is Black's thought experiment with two qualitatively identical iron spheres.
Okay.
Haecceists say we can easily imagine worlds where these spheres switch places, or where they're replaced by two other identical spheres. And since these worlds would only differ in the identity of the spheres, not in any of the properties, this seems to support Haecceitism.
So the thinking is, if I can clearly imagine two identical things switching places and nothing changes qualitatively, then those must be different possibilities, different only in terms of which object is which.
Exactly. Melia's example of a symmetrical cylinder falling in different directions on a homogeneous plane makes a similar point.
Okay.
The different outcomes only seem to be different because of where the cylinder ends up, which is a non-qualitative difference.
Then there are the conceivability arguments that use a more first-person or inside kind of imagination, right?
Yes. David Lewis's thought experiment about a world with eternal recurrence is a good example.
Okay.
He says we can imagine ourselves in different cycles of this recurrence, even though each cycle is qualitatively identical. The only difference seems to be which specific cycle we're in, which is non-qualitative.
It's like imagining living the same day twice, but knowing that the second time is a different instance of that day, and I'm the one experiencing that second instance.
Exactly. And Lewis's twin example works similarly. We're asked to imagine living the life of one of two identical twins.
Okay.
Since the world is qualitatively the same in both scenarios, the only difference is which twin we are, which again seems non-qualitative.
The entry also mentions the idea of conceiving our own non-existence in a world that's otherwise qualitatively the same as ours.
Yeah.
That one's hard to wrap your head around.
It is. The argument is that a good account of possibility should allow for the possibility of you not existing, even if everything else is the same.
Okay.
Bricker argues that to make sense of this, we need a sophisticated theory of counterparts across possible worlds.
And then there's Adam's example with Castor and Pollux, the two identical celestial globes. The main point there seems to be that the Haecceitistic difference, specifically which globe stops existing in a certain scenario, becomes clear when we imagine it from the perspective of someone on one of the globes.
Right. That example really shows how intuitive Haecceitism can be when we look at it from the individual's point of view.
Yeah.
Now, the entry also lays out the two main ways anti-Haecceitists respond to these conceivability arguments.
Okay.
Usually, they either say that what we can imagine isn't necessarily metaphysically possible, or that the scenarios Haecceitists describe aren't truly conceivable in the way they think they are.
Right. They might say our imagination is limited or can trick us, leading us to think we're imagining non-qualitative differences when really there are subtle qualitative differences, or the scenarios are just incoherent.
Exactly. Now, the second big argument for Haecceitism is Chisholm's paradox. This one is more formal.
It is. It starts with the idea that objects can have slightly different properties in different possible worlds, which seems pretty uncontroversial. Then it takes this idea through a series of small modal variations.
And the paradox shows that if we accept this, and if we accept that identity is transitive across these modal transitions, we end up with a weird conclusion that an individual could end up having all the properties of a completely different individual.
So if we imagine a world where Adam lived 1 year longer than he actually did, and then another world where that Adam lived another year longer, and so on, we could eventually imagine an Adam who has Noah's entire lifespan and all his other properties.
Exactly. And because Noah's properties include extrinsic ones that define the qualitative character of the whole world, if Adam could have all of Noah's properties, then there must be a world where Adam plays Noah's role in a world that's qualitatively identical to ours. That would
Yeah.
seem to be a purely Haecceitistic difference.
Wow. So if Chisholm's paradox is right, it's a strong argument for Haecceitism, but the entry also says it could lead to extreme anti-essentialism. How does that work?
Because you can make a similar Chisholm sequence for any two individuals.
Okay.
By imagining small changes in properties, we could show that any individual could have all the properties of any other individual. So the Eiffel Tower could end up with all of Barack Obama's properties and vice versa. This suggests that neither of them has any distinctive essential properties.
That's a pretty radical conclusion. It seems philosophers have tried to find ways around Chisholm's paradox.
Yeah, they have. Some question whether the kind of modal logic used in the paradox is valid. Others appeal to the idea that counterpart relations, used in counterpart theory, might not be transitive in the relevant scenarios. Some try to find a specific premise in the paradox to deny. And then there are those, like J.L. Mackie, who just accept the anti-essentialist conclusion.
So the arguments for Haecceitism are definitely interesting. They make you think about what's possible and what the logical consequences of our assumptions might be. Now let's switch gears and look at the arguments against Haecceitism. What are the main ones?
Well, the entry says that many philosophers who reject Haecceitism do so because of their broader views about reality or modality. For example, generalism, which says there are no individuals, just properties, obviously rules out Haecceitism.
Okay.
And necessitarianism, which says there's only one possible world, also doesn't allow for Haecceitistic differences.
So if your basic metaphysical framework is really simple, then Haecceitism doesn't fit. The entry also mentions Armstrong's philosophy, which emphasizes naturalism and combinatorialism as generally being against Haecceitism. And there's the common intuition that it just seems unlikely that God could create a bunch of identical universes that only differ in who exists in them.
Right. Many philosophers find the idea of these bare differences, where individuals are different but there's no qualitative difference, to be strange and suspicious. But then the entry goes into two more specific arguments against Haecceitism. First, there's the argument against bare identities. What's that all about?
That argument, put forward by Graham Forbes, says that if Haecceitism is true, there must be facts about the identity of individuals that aren't based on any properties. And the objection is that these bare identity facts can't be explained and should be rejected.
The idea is that if you can imagine two worlds that are qualitatively identical, but have different individuals, say different steel towers in Paris, then the only difference between those worlds is a bare fact. One tower is identical to itself in one world, and the other tower is identical to itself in the other. But there's no qualitative difference to explain why they're different. Anti-Haecceitists argue that all facts about identity should be based on properties.
But the entry points out that even the identity of properties might not be grounded in anything deeper, and it asks whether the argument against bare identities already assumes that Haecceitism is false, making the argument circular.
Right. The worry is that it might beg the question if it just assumes that properties have to be the basis of identity. The second big argument against Haecceitism that the entry talks about is based on the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, or PII.
Okay.
Which says that if two things have all the same properties, they must be the same thing. This seems to go against Haecceitism, which says there could be individuals who are qualitatively the same but numerically different.
It does seem like a problem. But the entry makes a distinction between PII as it applies to objects within a world, PII objects, and as it applies to whole worlds, PII worlds.
Right. David Lewis, for example, said he accepts PII objects, but that doesn't rule out Haecceitism, because Haecceitism is about worlds.
Yeah.
And his cheap Haecceitism tries to allow for Haecceitistic possibilities without saying that qualitatively identical worlds are actually different worlds.
So even if you think two things in the same world can't be completely identical, you could still say there are different possible worlds that are qualitatively identical but have different individuals in them. And Lewis's cheap Haecceitism tries to capture that without having to say those worlds are different.
Exactly. The entry also notes that using PII gets even more complicated when you have Haecceitist views of possible worlds.
Okay.
Because then you run the risk of just denying Haecceitism without giving a real reason for rejecting it. And of course, there's the question of whether PI itself is a good principle, given thought experiments like black spheres.
So the relation between PII and Haecceitism is tricky and depends on how you understand both of them. Now, the entry also talks about restricting Haecceitism. Why would you want to do that?
This approach tries to find a middle ground. It recognizes that some Haecceitistic scenarios are plausible, but others are problematic. So instead of fully accepting or rejecting Haecceitism, they try to limit it to certain areas. The entry uses the example of Leibniz's shift argument against absolute space.
Okay.
Leibniz argued that a world that's identical to ours but shifted in space shouldn't count as a different world. This suggests that maybe Haecceitistic differences based on location are problematic for some philosophers.
Right.
One way to deal with this is to say that Haecceitism is okay in some areas, like when talking about individual things, but not in others, like absolute space. The point is that it's important to be specific about which kinds of Haecceitistic differences we're talking about.
So you don't have to pick a side completely. You can be more nuanced and accept some kinds of Haecceitistic possibilities while rejecting others. Finally, the entry talks about how Haecceitism connects to other areas of philosophy. First, there's a connection with Quidditism. How are they related?
Quidditism is basically the Haecceitism of properties.
Okay.
While Haecceitism says individuals could swap roles without any qualitative change, Quidditism says properties could swap roles in the laws of nature without changing their qualitative nature.
So imagine a scenario where mass and electric charge switch roles in the laws of physics, but mass and charge themselves stay the same. That's what Quidditism is about.
Exactly. And the entry points out that the arguments for and against these two ideas are similar.
Okay.
Conceivability, combinatorial principles, and modal intuitions all come up in both debates. They also both face similar concerns about their epistemological consequences, like whether Quidditism leads to the idea that we can never really know the true nature of properties.
It seems like if you're inclined to accept Haecceitism, you might also be inclined to accept Quidditism. But, as the entry says, it's important to think about whether the difference between individuals and properties might mean we should treat these two ideas differently.
Yeah, that's a good point. The metaphysics of individuals and properties are different, and that might give us reasons to accept one and reject the other. Now, what about the connection between Haecceitism and personal identity?
The connection there seems to be about the difference between qualitative and non-qualitative facts. The simple view of personal identity says that our identity over time is a basic, non-qualitative fact. It often uses fission cases to argue that identity isn't just about physical or psychological continuity.
Okay.
This seems similar to Haecceitism, which says there are non-qualitative facts about identity.
Right. If, in a fission case, the original person could be identical to either of the resulting people in different but qualitatively identical scenarios, then personal identity can't just be about qualitative facts. This supports the Haecceitistic idea that non-qualitative facts about identity are important.
And the debate about whether personal identity can be reduced to qualitative properties also comes down to whether we need a basic notion of identity that goes beyond those properties.
Exactly. So this distinction between qualitative and non-qualitative is important for both Haecceitism and personal identity. Now, what about Haecceitism and physicalism? That seems like there could be conflict there.
Yeah, if physicalism is the view that everything is determined by physical facts, then Haecceitistic differences, the idea of physically identical worlds with different individuals, seem to challenge that.
That's the initial problem.
Oh.
But the entry points out that you can understand physicalism as just saying that all qualitative properties are determined by physical properties.
Okay.
In that case, Haecceitism, which is about non-qualitative differences, might not be a problem. Some philosophers, like David Chalmers, have even decided to ignore the issue of Haecceitism when talking about physicalism.
So the conflict depends on how you define physicalism. If it's about everything, then Haecceitism is a challenge. If it's just about qualitative stuff, then they might be compatible. What about the connection to space-time? The entry mentions the whole argument.
The whole argument is a problem for substantivalism, the view that spacetime exists independently of matter.
Okay.
It uses the idea of haeceitistically different models of spacetime to argue that substantivalism leads to indeterminism. Anti-Haecceists could use this argument to reject those models.
So by saying that Haecceitistic differences in spacetime aren't possible, they could avoid the indeterminism problem. But the entry also says Haecceitists have ways to respond to this, maybe by changing how we define determinism.
Exactly. They could say determinism is about qualitatively discernible possibilities, so Haecceitistic differences in spacetime wouldn't necessarily lead to any observable indeterminism. And finally, what about the connection to philosophy of language?
It seems like the connection is through Haecceites. If you think Haecceites are real, they could be useful for theories of language, especially when talking about singular terms like names and about individuals who don't exist. The Haecceite can stand in for the individual.
Right. So if the meaning of a name like Obama includes the Haecceite of being Barack Obama, then that meaning can still exist even in worlds where Obama never existed.
Okay.
The entry also mentions that Haecceites could be used in the semantics of demonstratives, like this and that, and in analyzing how we talk about things de re, which means about the thing itself.
So Haecceitism and the idea of Haecceites could help us understand how language refers to individuals and how we can think about them in different possible situations.
It provides a potential metaphysical basis for how we use singular terms and how we track individuals across possibilities.
Wow, we really went deep into Haecceitism. Let's try to summarize what we've learned.
Okay, so the basic idea of Haecceitism is that there could be differences between possible worlds that aren't about the properties in those worlds, but about which individuals exist and what roles they play, even if all the properties are the same.
We talked about the arguments for it, like the conceivability of swapping identical objects or imagining ourselves in different scenarios, and the challenge of Chisholm's paradox.
And we looked at the arguments against it, which often come from bigger metaphysical views, concerns about bare identity facts, and the implications of the principle of the identity of indiscernibles.